Okay, great. So we are on presentation session 8, which is filled with 3 incredible presentations. First, from Jada Williams, Dr. Melina McConatha, Julian Murray, and they will be talking about interdisciplinary food studies, Black sovereignty scholarship, and curriculum development. That will be followed by Phillips Thomas Hornbuckle, speaking on feeding on a small scale, building and sustaining campus food pantries, and then Dr. Linton Williams, who will be talking about the cycle of poverty and trauma, understanding its effects on the self-esteem and social development of minorities. So with that, it looks like it is 12:50, and I know some people will be continuing to stream in during the presentations, but it's a tight day, jam-packed, so I suggest that we get started now. So I will turn it over to my friend and colleague, Dr. McConatha.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate being here, and my students will be taking the lead on this share. I just wanted to give you a little background on our presentation and some of our work. My name is Melina McConatha. I'm a professor of psychology and human services at Lincoln University. It's a first degree granting historically Black college in the United States. And today we're going to be sharing some of our work on Black food sovereignty and specifically discussing about the role of Black food sovereignty and social healing. I'm going to let Jada and Julian introduce themselves, and we'll share a little bit of what we found.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jada Williams. I'm a graduating senior at Lincoln University, majoring in human services. I am from New Jersey, and I'm so excited to present Black Food Sovereignty, a curriculum for healing. Julian, can you hear us?
I'll go ahead and move forward. I'll let Julian jump in when he's ready. So we're going to share a little bit about the work that we did behind this curriculum. As I mentioned, it's a student-powered project. This was funded by the National Science Foundation. And this was in an effort to really work on diversity and inclusion in sustainability work, and specifically in food studies. And our question began with the conversation about, can Black food sovereignty and a Black food sovereignty course and curriculum contribute to social healing? So the majority of work we're sharing talks about how we came up with our curriculum and the information that informed our work.
Black food sovereignty operationalized. Black leadership in food systems to mobilize communities, reestablishing connections with the land, and provide healthy and culturally appropriate food nourishment to historically Black spaces.
So one of the things we wanted to do before we get started is kind of define Black food sovereignty. And as I mentioned, this was a student-led project. So our students really worked to kind of different community leaders to define what Black food sovereignty was, as Julian shared. And the other element was looking at this from an intersectional lens. So besides centering the Black identity, one thing that was really important to our students was to look at the intersecting nature of other identities. And there are many elements that come into play with this, but specifically age, culture, gender, sexuality, ability, education. Location was a really big piece if you're coming from a rural area versus an urban area. Language was a large element of this, and talking about economics when we discuss some of this work.
So for our curriculum, we used a lot of digital stories and narratives surrounding Black food. We specifically studied a lot of archives around the Black Panthers, especially their free breakfast program. And we used social media posts from Black community leaders to understand how we can contribute to this fight and to this project. We learned how to conduct research on past archives.
And this was really a great part of the project because we were so fortunate as the first HBCU to have the entire collection of the Black Panther newsletters. So working in those archives was such a great contribution to this curriculum, to pull in the historical piece and look at some of the voices from the past relating to food. Julian, I think you're muted. Julian, I believe you're muted.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
There we go.
We can hear you now.
Participatory digital action research. Common themes from data collection partnered with community engagement of Black-ran food programs informed our work. Our HBCU food Instagram page was utilized to connect with diverse groups of leaders and hold ourselves accountable.
So as leaders in this field, we had to take into consideration that we have to hold ourselves accountable. And so to hold ourselves accountable, we did a lot of feminist reflexive journaling. So we conducted journals on how food made us feel and how our feelings were throughout the whole project. And we continue to post on our social media page.
Julian, you're muted again. I'll go ahead and share a little bit of his work. And this is some of our, this is Julian's first presentation. So I believe, are you ready? Okay, great.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll start over, I'm sorry. Black Food Sovereignty Community Engagement Partners. National Black Food Justice and Justice Alliance, Black Urban Growers Association, Rise and Root Farm, Social Generation, Detroit Black Community Food Security Network, and Farms to Grow Incorporated.
And this was really an exciting piece of working with the communities through the challenges of COVID. So using social media as a way to engage with these community leaders. The students found it really interesting and engaging to be able to interact on Instagram, TikTok, other social media platforms to provide feedback as they established what the key points of the curriculum needed to be and what the most important narratives that needed to have visibility in the curriculum were. So that was really an interesting piece.
Okay, so a lot of the things that we wanted to focus on were publishing the boundaries of identity, intersectional lens. So we want to make sure that LGBTQIA2S+ individuals are active in this fight as they are discriminated against in food justice and other systems. So we want to make sure that they are also a part of agriculture and farming. We want to deconstruct false narratives or whitewashing. So we want Black leaders to be able to tell their own stories and not have to rely on white authors and white journalists telling their stories for them. So we want to create new narratives and make sure that we amplify the voices of Black leaders. And we want to make sure that their voices are heard and their concerns are actually being considered. Intergenerational practices and recipes passed across families and generational learning traditions. We want to grow not just regular plants and foods for us, but we want to grow plants and foods that we actually want and not rely on supermarkets and other systems to create the food that we want. And we want to be able to have a connection with the land, which is why we're saying growing healthy relationships with the land. We want to make sure that we establish that connection with the land that our ancestors have had previously. And we want to continue to fight in food justice, which is a nonviolent food system, because we're currently living in a violent system where we have to rely on fast food establishments placed in our communities. We have to rely on government assistance programs that provide food for us. So food justice is fighting for us to create our own system. And we also want to incorporate Indigenous wisdom and honoring our ancestral connections. So we did a lot of research on gardening from our grandparents and farming and agriculture and how our ancestors participated in this fight before we even got started and even thought about fighting for food justice.
And I think this was a really important piece about looking at how a curriculum can be healing. And these were the common themes that came up from our students as the most important piece of healing when we're talking about food and when we're talking specifically about Black food sovereignty. So looking at the visibility, looking at deconstructing the narrative, looking at the whitewashing of food justice in general. And that was why this was a really important project to be student driven. Looking at the identities of the faculty, the administrators, the journal, the identities of most of the people that publish in journals in food studies. So again, really looking at these elements and how these are pieces of healing when we talk about Black food sovereignty. And I think these were one of the most important parts.
Planting seeds change. Our future Black leaders. This isn't an overnight success. Stay focused and continue to educate ourselves and others in the community, introduce fruits, vegetables, and growing early to children, connect with Black farmers and seed keepers, support Black-owned restaurants in your local community. Always remember our food is freedom, and remember we are all working from our own standpoints, race, gender, sexuality, age, ability, and location to shape our experiences.
And Julian did a good job of kind of summarizing some of the important messages from Black leaders that my students kind of collected from their interactions. But it was one of the elements that we haven't shared, but was a really great project, was they created a database of Black-run food programs in their communities and in other communities, and created that database for moving forward when we looked at how community engagement and healing happened in Black food sovereignty. So that's pretty much a summary of the work that we were doing to contribute to creating this curriculum and moving forward. This is a 4-year project. So now that we have created the curriculum itself, the implementation is looking forward. We're going to offer the course in spring of 2022. There's going to be some hands-on experience of working with the land, growing their own food. And then we're also have a goal of developing an intersectional assessment program. So finding a program that actually we're partnering with an organization called Longwood Gardens in our area, where we're developing a program that they can assess the diversity and inclusion aspect of their work, and looking at how to create more spaces for Black and Brown leaders in green spaces. So we're really looking forward to that. And then our ultimate goal is by 2024, we're going to host a Black Food Sovereignty Conference. Thank you. That's about it.
Wow, this is incredible work, and thank you all so much. We will have time for questions and discussion after the next 2 presentations to include this one, but this is really exciting. Thank you. So next I'd like to reintroduce Phillips Thomas Hornbuckle to talk about feeding on a small scale, building and sustaining campus food pantries.
Thank you so much. Let me pull it up.
And if Melina, if you just take, stop the slide share on your side would be great.
I'm so sorry. Yes, I'm getting to that.
No worries.
Right. Sorry, students are finding me. And so my phone is going insane. I apologize. Let me pull this up. Okay. All right. Can y'all see it okay? Great. So thank you all so much. My presentation is on feeding on a small college scale. I want to share with you all kind of the timeline of what it took for us to build and establish our Spartan Food Pantry. So we are just gonna run through how we got there, the obstacles, potential partners that we encountered, and then the ways that we've been working to reduce stigma around food insecurity. Before I get started, I do just want to offer this quick land acknowledgement. I know a lot of us are coming in from different virtual spaces, but our York College campus is operating on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories that were originally inhabited by the Susquehannock, Nanticoke, and Piscataway Native American tribes. And so it's just important to acknowledge that their descendants are still very much present and persisting in the face of the long-term effects of colonialism. And if you're curious to learn more about who was in spaces that you are navigating first, nativeland.ca is a great website that lets you kind of zoom in and move around. So some of you may be wondering like why I am in here as director of the Intercultural Student Life and Global Programming Office. We work to create those multicultural programming and DEI spaces on campus that include our students who experience homelessness, home insecurity, or food insecurity. So for us in 2016, a student was found sleeping in her vehicle. No one was aware that she had been experiencing any kind of basic needs insecurity because she was a student leader on campus. She was very visible. And they all thought she was achieving well academically. There were no real indicators for them that she was in need. The community rally, we were able to secure resources that were helpful for her to persist and graduate, but we knew where there's one, there could be 10, where there's 10, there could be 100. So we began looking at our stats, looking at our area. Thank you. And we know that about 99% of all of our students, and these are based on 2018 stats moving forward, receive some form of financial aid. About a third of our students identify as low income. And we were fortunate to be able to participate in the Hope Center's survey around basic needs and security. And we were able to learn that of the students who were surveyed, about 41% of them indicated they had experienced food or housing insecurity or homelessness in 2018. So generally, when we look at nationally compared to four-year institutions in the United States, as well as like York County proper, we are faring ahead of where others are. But York County still has a lot of need. Our county insecurity rate is a little over 10%. And 100% of our students are eligible for free and reduced lunches in York City School District. So when we talked about deciding what to do, we started with very basic things that students could take and run with, right? So your pudding cups, your crackers, your snack bars, just things that if you're hungry, send them to ISLGP and we will we'll get something in their belly, whether it's a bag of chips or what have you. But we knew that we needed to think more thoughtfully if we were going to make that a sustainable practice. So we thought about, what is this going to add to our plate of the services we provide? Does this line up with our mission, vision, and goals? How are we establishing a support network so that we are not the end all be all point of support? And where are we recognizing that the support they need is better coming from a different office and is already efficiently being met from another office? And then finally, reducing the stigma around it. We had to find that student in her car before we were able to notice that they had additional needs. So we had these first steps. We needed to figure out what can we do on what we have, who can help us expand upon that, what are the barriers we're going to need to navigate, and how do we gather data while preserving privacy so that we can tell our story. So we were fortunate to have a wide range of people who were excited to help, who were very thoughtful about what they could contribute and tireless in when and how they provided that assistance. So we had it from individual students all the way to national centers and databases offering resources, ongoing education, access to data, helping us analyze data, and then expanding our inventory. And with the assistance of all of this, it was also important that we were tempering expectations. And so, conversations around, well, why aren't we having a massive dedicating massive space? Well, we're in a student union, we're competing for space. Why aren't we allowing more people to volunteer? Well, there's a matter of maintaining privacy. So really learning to temper expectations and enthusiasm in a way where we are not dampening the excitement and the support, but we're also guaranteeing privacy and maintaining dignity for the students who would need to access the resource. So when we drafted our to-do list, we thought about, these are the things that we knew we would have to set up in order to make sure the pantry was not going to be kind of a one-hit wonder. Making sure the physical space that we allocated was appropriate and that could be easily maintained, the financial stability of it, looking at the reduction of stigma internally and externally, and then leveraging the data. So how did all that come to play? This is our pantry now. We moved from that one shelf picture that you all saw to this. As you can see, these photos show a range of timed foods, right? We have breakfast, lunch, dinner, soups. We were able to extend into personal hygiene products because we also know about the pink tax for feminine hygiene products, but also personal hygiene products like detergent, deodorant, toothbrush, toothpaste. Those were things that students were also struggling to be able to afford. And so we were really proud to make that happen. And we think about putting it together, the stigma reduction was key. So the support is great, but we also want to make sure that students are understanding the intent behind it, because hunger should not be a reason you are not succeeding in college and you are not persisting. And so these were the assumptions and the stigmas that we worked to reduce. And when we talk to other people about it, these are the analogies I use. Where are you using a carrot? Are you giving them carrot cake, or are you using a switch? Not everybody likes carrots, but they're healthy, they're good for you, right? Some people kind of like carrot cake, maybe they don't, but then there's switches. And we talk about the microaggressions that can kind of be like carrot cake. Like the good intention is in there, but it's not landing well. Carrots are healthy. Like there's no, like when we do things that are based on data, based on best practices, those are the carrots we're talking about. And then there's the switches, like the overt microaggressions, and the biases that come out when we're not productively supporting students who may be in positions of need. Our main source of data has been working with the Hope Center for College Community and Justice out of Temple University. And with their assistance and foresight, we've been able to expand our inventory. We've increased our network of supporters. We now have a quick fix initiative. So for students who don't have time or the ability to do a full shopping appointment, they can still come into our office and get a brown paper bag with, chips, a snack, a fruit cup, and a bottle of water, and a tuna pouch or something that they can easily heat in the microwave or just open, eat, and go. We have ongoing collaboration with faculty, like the incredible FYS with Dr. Kay McAdams, who has an ongoing class for students to really engage with this topic from an academic lens. And we've been able to provide additional guidance and resources for our shoppers as they come in. We're hoping to formalize that volunteer pool, identify additional revenue streams, and our incredible biology department has also decided to start hooking us up in the future with cucumbers and lettuces and all these other fresh produce things that, again, go to maintaining that dignity piece for our students who shop. So I'm trying to keep to time. So thank you all so much for that. Hopefully I was not too quick for the caption to catch everything, but thank you all so much.
That was wonderful. Thank you. And we'll have questions and discussions after our next presentation for all three. So our next presentation is from Dr. Linton Williams, and they will be discussing the cycle of poverty and trauma, understanding its effects on the self-esteem and social development of minorities.
Hello, everyone.
Hi.
Okay, let me get this thing up here. All right, so I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me. I'd like to thank Dr. McConatha, my colleague, for even telling me about this situation, and thank Amanda for allowing me to present. So I'm gonna get started because we don't have much time. So you have to put on your virtual running shoes so we can all keep up. All right, so we're looking at the cycle of poverty and trauma. Through this presentation, we're going to try to understand the effects that it has on one's self-esteem and social development for minorities. Not to say that non-minorities do not experience poverty and trauma, but the Black and Hispanics are overwhelmingly represented in this area. So that's what we're going to focus on. So we're going to look at a few definitions. We're going to look at some characteristics, and then we're going to, well, I'm going to leave you with the question, what can you do? So when we're looking at poverty, we're understanding that poverty is a conditional situation where one lacks the basic necessities for living. Those basic necessities would be food, water, and shelter. Not only do they lack it, there's an inability to actually sustain it. So we're only because there's not much employment opportunities. The cost of living, the cost of food rises, and the steady income. There's limited income. The income is not steady. So it's in essence, we're looking at poverty. When we look at trauma, we can see that it hinders a person's ability to cope with stress, cope with the stress that actually poverty produces. So this inability to cope and actively deal with the stressors, it it or when you try to cope with it, it's not an appropriate way, it's inappropriate. So you get certain type of behaviors which can be considered adaptive for that environment for poverty. However, it may not yield positive benefits. So poverty, it creates symptoms of depression and anxiety. The effectiveness of the mental health services in impoverished areas, it it appears to be impotent. Not only that, it could be underrepresented. So the drive for mental health services may not be a priority, or it may not they may not even be aware of some of the services that can be offered to help deal with this. So as we move forward, we can see that poverty in itself is a traumatic event. It is a traumatic situation, and it causes one to have limitations in the way that they process cognitively, um, process information, and cope with the environment. So we see decision-making skills that are hindered, um, and so forth. So let's look at some of these characteristics. It creates an attitude of failure and inferiority. So looking at this, when we view the world through impoverished lenses, the, we see the world in a different light. And so if I'm born into poverty, the attitude can be adopted that I will not succeed, but I need to survive. The attitude is I must be less than, I must be lower, I'm not that important, and I may not be worthy of the things that are outside of poverty because this is where I am. And we have this internal frustration, the anger that is turned inward. Um, so you get this feeling of disgracefulness, and they can feel guilt for who they are. And from this point, they're stripped of a sense of humanity. And, you know, there's an attempt to reclaim um, that humanity. There's an attempt to eliminate that feeling. Um, However, that attempt may not be productive. From there, we go to attitudes and overt behaviors. So we tend to see more aggressive, verbally aggressive behavior, physical aggressive behavior. We see that anger that probably was once inward turned outward towards others now. There's a sense of bullying, theft, and there's this concept of disrespect that exists, and disrespect takes on a different type of mentality when we're dealing with those who are impoverished. Um, Institutions at this point, where there's a different view of poverty and those who are in poverty uh, that may not be as accurate. You can tell someone to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, not understanding that you have to have a pair of boots to even do that. So when we're dealing with people that are in impoverished areas, sometimes the understanding of that situation is limited. So we get an inactivity. We people are stifled, or systems are stifled, and we then try to, and then there's an explosion. So the explosion looks like drug use, the homicide rates increase, and mental health challenges run rampant. They run rampant. So then there's an abrupt withdrawal of different programs. Well, and instead of saying withdrawal, we could say the programs can be ineffective. The programs are not designed to move one out of poverty. So we have different programs like Head Start, food stamp program or welfare, Section 8 and things like that. So the programs can be they can be ineffective, and they actually reinforce the attitude um, that we're trying to change, that we're trying to eliminate. So we get this cycle here: attitudes of inferiority versus superiority. We get that inward frustration, and then that inward frustration turns to an outward, a different view, an outward assessment. So we get these overt behaviors that are adaptive to the environment, but not productive. You get inactivity when there's nothing being done about this situation, or what's being done is ineffective. So you have a flare up of destructive behaviors, and these destructive behaviors um, what we see as far as the mental health illnesses, increased drug use, homicides, and then there's an effort to control that. And control can look like over policing or insensitive policing, where there's an attitude towards people that are impoverished that reinforces some of the negative attitudes that they have about themselves. So from there, you get the arrow going right back to attitudes of inferiority versus superiority. So that would be the cycle. And so here's a list basically of what poverty and trauma, or what poverty can cause. Uh, some of the feelings, and you can see some of these things are related to different mental illnesses. So from this, I just leave you with the question, like, what can we do about poverty? I hope I didn't go too fast, but that's it. That's the end.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Williams, and thank you for everybody in this presentation session. I'd like to open it up now to some questions, and I know that there was a question up here for Jada and Julian and Melina. It says, really cool work. How does seasonality impact when you offer this course?
Yeah, I'm happy to share a little bit about that. We basically have created a learning opportunity with every season. So for this fall, we're going to focus on what you can grow in the fall. We're also going to focus on food preservation as part of Black food sovereignty. We are going to explore some elements of growing inside and also creating tinctures. So we're hoping to have the students become more familiar with how seasons affect the sustainable practices and learning, and also figure out how the curriculum needs to shift as the year changes.
Thank you. And could you share just a little bit more about what would achieving food sovereignty look like?
Jada, would you like to share your
Yes.
perspective on that? Okay.
Yes, I would say more people of color, communities of color, being able to work in community gardens and have more land on their own. I think it's less than 3% of Black people have land in general. And I remember, like, during Reconstruction days, we were promised land. And when we had land, it was burned and destroyed. And then it was bought, and we had to work on that just to earn money, like land that was supposed to be ours. So now we're trying to refocus on getting that land back. So food sovereignty would be us getting that land back, not having to rely on unhealthy food, which is causing health disparities. That is even worse, because then if you don't have insurance or you come from low income communities, how can you afford to upkeep the disorders that you have because of these fast food establishments? So food sovereignty would be basically eliminating all the things that is wrong in this system and taking control of our own destiny in regards to food.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Really appreciate that. And Phillips just wrote, we had students this year researching food deserts in their classes, and I can't wait to push this facet of their conversation this way. Absolutely. And I'd love to just share the work of another one of our UD colleagues, Latiana Tab, who's working in Philadelphia with Black Girls Green Thumbs, and they might be a really wonderful connection to make if you don't know them yet. And in Phillips, I have a question in regards to, is there conversation with food services on campus about meal plans and things like that to make that more accessible in and of itself? So possibly the need for a pantry might be reduced. Are they sort of a partner in this conversation?
So they are a partner in that Chartwell's is, it's a corporate entity, so they're a little bit limited in what they can do, and because York is a smaller institution, their leeway looks different. So we know at other institutions, Chartwell's has a deal with Student Senate, with the institution, that students can donate a limited number of meals off of their meal plan into like a swipe bank. And then if a student is food insecure and they request a meal swipe, it can be transferred to their card, or they can request it at the register and they're allowed in. For smaller institutions like us, like economically, I don't know if it's not necessarily always feasible, but what they have done is they do fundraisers and drives for us. So students who are using their meal points or using their dining dollars at certain locations that Chartwell's manages, they'll say for every transaction, we will match that price in the donation of bottles of water and donation of the snacks and the food items that they can purchase at an economical rate. And so they are partners for us in that. Student Senate and some other I'll call them activists, because that's what they are at this point. Ones who are really pushing for Chartwell's to identify more ways to create a swipe donation bank at a smaller institution like we are, is an ongoing conversation we're having, but they are actively aware of the work we're doing and they are supportive here.
That's great. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
And Dr. Williams, I would love to hear your thoughts on the question that you just ended with about what can we all do in relation to alleviating poverty. And I'd love to even narrow down a little bit about what can we do to raise awareness of the impact that of poverty as a form of systematic violence and the impact that it has on well-being and mental health.
Okay, which question should I answer first?
Whatever, take whatever you like, do whatever you wish with that. That's a big one.
Okay, now one of the things that we I guess we can do is hold systems accountable and place a demand to make alleviating poverty a priority. Without doing that, what we'll end up getting is continued issues within that community, but it definitely will continue to spill out of the community. If people are impoverished, no one is progressing. So one of the things that we can do is bring attention and place a demand on the powers to be to help eliminate poverty. Now I forgot the other questions, I'm sorry.
You know, and maybe for time, I should just hold it in,
Okay.
but here's, I feel as though, especially in this times in which there are mass shooters or who are predominantly white, there's a conversation that comes that there's a mental health issue that is a problematic question in and of itself, but it always seems to come up when you look at areas that all have high homicide that may not be met, that are in more impoverished areas. There's rarely that conversation, at least in public discourse, about the impact of mental health. And I find that to be troubling and problematic. And I'd love to hear at some point your perspective on what we do to shift that conversation. But thank you all so much. And I wonder, perhaps it's good to just, for the sake of time, to switch presentations now. But this has been given us so much to think about, and it's such fantastic work. Thank you all so much for taking the time. Now I'd like us to move into presentation session 9 with Amber Wagman and James Riese from Turning Point York. And Turning Point York is also participating in Give Local York, and I'll put the link in the chat. Great. And I'm not sure, Amber and Jane, were you able to join?
Yes, we are here. Thank you so much, Amanda, and thank you everyone for having us here today and for posting the Give Local link. That's wonderful. There's lots of great donating happening so far today, and we're really thankful for that. So I am the executive director. My name is Amber Crawford Wagman, and I'm the executive director of a nonprofit here in York called Turning Point Counseling and Advocacy Center. And we are dedicated to working with all survivors of childhood sexual abuse. So anyone really from ages 2.5 or 3, as soon as they are verbal enough to process and speak, all the way up, women, men, children. And we offer a variety of services. So not only do we offer the typical individual and group counseling, but we really feel like there is no one right way to heal from childhood sexual abuse trauma. And so what works for one survivor might not work for another. And because of that, you know, we also understand that talk therapy isn't for everyone. And we know that sometimes we can be with a therapist and we can be processing and talking every week, and we're still not getting to that core piece of trauma that has happened to us. And so we really believe in offering survivors a variety of experiential therapies to assist with the talk therapy at the same time. So we offer trauma-centered, trauma-sensitive yoga. And I'm not going to speak too much on that because that Jane is our trauma-centered, trauma-sensitive yoga therapist. So I'm going to let her talk more about that. But we also offer art and music counseling, and then Reiki services, which is a new piece of it. In this last year, you know, with COVID, everyone's lives have changed, and the way that we provide services have changed for so many of us. At this time, we are now able to offer in-person sessions, but over this last year, we've kind of gone in and out of telehealth, and some of our clients have thrived and absolutely loved it. So that is something that we as an agency are going to continue to offer moving forward. So if people feel more comfortable doing it through telehealth, we are all about supporting that. We also provide medical and legal advocacy for our clients and for survivors. You know, some of the things that survivors talk about that are really difficult for them are, one, the criminal justice process that many have to go through after they've been abused, and 2, any kind of medical appointments, specifically the dentist or a GYN exam. These are things that many of us in our daily lives don't even think twice about, but for survivors, they are extremely triggering events. And so we offer our services to help educate the medical professionals, help educate the legal system, but then also accompany our clients to those appointments. And we'll sit in the waiting room with you, or we'll go to court and we'll be in that front row when you have to testify. You know, we really feel like survivors, to help them regain their excuse me, their power and control that was taken from them when they were abused, by helping them find their voice again. And really what we know people need is they need to be validated, they need to be heard, and they need to be supported. And so that is our main goal at our agency every day. And I just want to thank you all for letting us be here and tell you about our services. And if you know anyone or you personally could benefit from this, please reach out to us. Cost is never an issue. We receive lots of funding from grants and scholarships, and days like today for Give Local York, that all goes into our scholarship fund so that no one ever has to worry about money when they're talking about healing. You know, it kind of fits right in with the last presentation that was happening. Someone who has gone through this should not have to think, well, I can't afford the best trauma-informed therapy. I have to, go this way or go that way or not get any at all. So for us, we really work hard to make sure that that is never a question on anyone's mind. And so now I'd like to introduce Jane Riese, and she is going to tell you all a little bit about trauma-centered, trauma-sensitive yoga.
Thank you very much, Amber. Thank you, Amanda, and everybody who's here. It is really an honor to be here today. I'm a licensed social worker as well as a certified facilitator in a very special type of yoga that Amber mentioned. We call it TCTSY. Honestly, we're very proud at Turning Point to offer this special type of yoga, which is an adjunct treatment for complex trauma. TCTSY originated believe it or not, in the early 2000s and was first studied by the Dutch psychiatrist, maybe you've heard of Bessel van der Kolk. And since then, of course, numerous research studies find that TCTSY participants really reach clinically significant reductions in PTSD symptoms. Now, trauma-sensitive yoga, really, why yoga? It provides a person an opportunity to spend time in their physical selves. One's body in which we live, of course, can feel unsafe, particularly if that's been, the location where the traumatic event took place specifically. And so TCTSY can be a chance to reclaim one's own physical self and maybe to begin to befriend or develop a more healthy relationship, being in one's own skin. So, how is TCTSY different than other forms of yoga? Which is a really interesting question. If any of you are familiar with yoga, you would certainly recognize the yoga that you're familiar with in TCTSY. But some of the main things about it that create differences are that it is choice-based. It is highly choice-based. So every time a movement is offered or a body shape is offered, it's offered as a choice. And I can give you, as at the very end, we may have a moment so I can kind of describe how I would use language to invite this. People are always choosing whether to move and how to move. I might move my arm all the way up. A participant may decide they would prefer to keep their arm closer in toward their body. I think of TCTSY in this way as accessible. I think yoga gets a reputation being for wealthy, white, rich, very physically fit, young females. And this type of yoga really is an invitation for anybody who would like to have chances to be in the present moment and experience their physical selves. We don't refer to them as poses or positions. We refer to them as shapes or forms. People can choose not to do the forms. An important part of this yoga is there's never hands-on. There's never physical assists that you might think of from other traditional yoga classes. Certainly, people are sometimes invited to notice what they feel in their bodies while it's happening. This is called interoception in the literature, where if you move your forehead, your chin down, you might notice a sensation in the upper part of your back. And of course, there's a possibility that you might not notice this sensation. So sometimes there are those invitations, and of course, there are always also those invitations to notice if you're breathing, if that's something that you want to do. It's interesting because TCTSY has traditionally been offered at the Boston Trauma Center in the group format. And we too at Turning Point can make TCTSY available in a group format. We can do that in our yoga studio in our new wonderful offices, or we can offer TCTSY in a virtual format. So the telehealth that Amber just referred to a moment ago. Apart from that, I'd be delighted to answer anybody's questions about it. You can also look at the book by co-director David Emerson, Trauma Sensitive Yoga and Therapy, Bringing the Body into Treatment, as one of the resources that is available. But we'll stick around in case there are any questions. And again, it's our pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for all the great work that all of you are doing in this important field.
Thanks, Jane.
Thank you both so much. We're just going to take the next presentation and then open it up to questions. So next I would like to introduce Colleen Ego and Jamie Russell through your county human services.
Hi, thank you.
Colleen, would you like me to share your slides or would you like to do so?
I believe Jamie has them, is going to share them. Thanks, Jamie. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Colleen Igo, and I'm with the York County System of Care. And you'll have an opportunity to meet Jamie in a few minutes. But first of all, I wanted to thank you for having us here, and Amanda for doing a great job in organizing this event. It's very informative, so thank you. What we wanted to do, Jamie, if you want to go to the next slide. What I wanted to do first is just tell you a little bit about System of Care if you have not heard about us. This is actually a grant that we received back in 2013. And the purpose of our group is to bring all of these silos together. So you'll see juvenile probation, children, youth and family, mental health, drug and alcohol, education, community, families, faith-based groups, to bring them all around the table to talk. And to talk about ways that we can provide better services for the people who are in our system and in our community. So that's our existence. That's why we are here. I wanted to mention, if anyone would like to learn more information about System of Care or be part of our quarterly meetings, to come around the table with these organizations, just put your name in the chat or you can email me. I have my email on the last slide. Okay, next slide. So for us, we wanted to give you the perspective from the county on what we did as far as building bridges to create a trauma-informed community within the county systems. So we recognize it's not only each of us individually looking at trauma, but also our providers, our educators, and our communities. And just from hearing everything I've heard today, we all drank the Kool-Aid. So I think we're all on the same page with this and building bridges. Next slide. For us, we were very strategic in how we approach trauma-informed care. We created a framework that included several entities and also several groups, and Jamie will go into that in a little more detail. And next slide. We talked about the 3 R's, and I think, like I said, we're all on the same page in that our readiness plan, that we realize we need to address this. Next slide. And when I say realize, it was really interesting. I pulled up some statistics that 61% of men and 51% of the women report at least one traumatic event in their lifetimes. That really brings things to light. So with all that being said, we recognize too that trauma is one of the top most common psychological health conditions. So that's got us in the right direction of looking at being a trauma-informed organization. Next slide. And of course, we recognize that. So I'm going to skip right to the next slide because I'm going to get into the nitty-gritty of some of the positive things that we have done as a county. And next slide. So from an example I want to share with you quickly is what we did as far as our relationship with the school districts. We had a grant, thankfully, through the Pennsylvania System of Care Partnership, and we were able to provide trauma-informed training to the following schools on your left. Included in that were 4-hour intensive trauma-informed trainings. We had excellent trainers, former educators actually, who presented trauma-informed information geared specifically to schools. School districts had hundreds of people participate, not just teachers, but also cafeteria workers, bus drivers. So we really had a huge audience of people. We also provided specialized coaching. With the grant money, we were able to provide a specific trauma-informed coach who would meet monthly with the school districts, and they would have a team of people from each school district share the issues that they might be having with the youth and how they might be able to address it and to be trauma sensitive to that student. So that was very successful. And then the other things we were able to provide were web-based training. And we also offer different trainings throughout the year, such as youth mental health first aid and QPR training, which is question, persuade, and refer. So these are just an example of some of the things that we've done to reach our audiences of educators. And I'm going to turn it over to Jamie to go over our next ways that we reached people.
Thank you, Colleen. I just want to give a few examples from our York County Human Services Department of some things that we've been able to do with Colleen and System of Care support. Our Human Services Department's been able to train all of our employees in a basic overview and skills in trauma-informed care. And then we were able to go through a similar process that the schools have gone through in certifying 22 staff members and one of our consumers as trauma competent professionals. So those individuals are now part of our trauma-informed leadership team, and they're responsible for guiding the department's focus on trauma-informed care with staff, clients, and the community. When we first started working on an organizational strategy, we did have a lot of questions. Even after our training, we had to take a step back, really figure out, how we wanted to approach such a valuable transformation. And as we look back at it now, there are really two key pieces of information that have stood out for us and guided our process. And I'm sorry, my slides aren't cooperating. There we go. So the first idea is of the parallel process. And Dr. Sandra Bloom, the author of the Sanctuary Model, really explains it best that just as we see individuals isolate and have those behaviors of withdrawal from the community when they experience trauma, organizations also face that same isolation when they're facing financial or political stressors. And that can kind of lead to some rigidity and, hierarchical decision making. So we really wanted to focus on intervening on that parallel process, shifting our behaviors and ways of thinking to a more positive set of values. So those would be those 6 trauma-informed principles that you see here. The second takeaway that our leadership team had from our training, our amazing trainers at Lakeside Global Institute, gave us one consistent message that healing really takes place in the context of healthy relationships and over time. So we took that to mean that when we engage in healthy relationships with one another and we're consistent in the positive regard, we engage with others, that we can really facilitate change in a natural and meaningful way that sticks. And with that, we really wanted to focus at our relationships at all levels of authority within the department. And our strategy really has to been to engage from that perspective, and making that be our, facilitation at all levels there. So I hope some of the tips I'm about to share with you kind of help, you to gain support from administrators, motivate staff, and really develop some peer support and self-care within your own organization. First, we kind of started off with working with administration. And in order to prepare for that, we really wanted to know where we were and where we were going. So we developed some strategic plans, put some practice models in place, and then really made an effort to, identify the steps that we needed to take along the way in partnership with our directors. And that investment has really, paid off for us along the way. We're really excited to see where we're going to be going down the road as we start focusing more on our own policies and procedures. Another key takeaway here is, when you're considering, what staff need, and I apologize, I think I went too far. Here we go. So when we considering what staff need, that basic training opportunities are really great. However, it's also important to recognize that, some of those informal interactions can be as valuable as the formal training. Engaging with peers, administration, and clients really allows you that opportunity to model those 3 R's that Colleen talked about and that we're all pretty familiar with. You might want to be mindful that people have different learning styles and are motivated in different ways. So providing information in different formats, using social media, really connecting with people through the interactions helps to kind of share that information and make things progress more naturally. Not everyone's going to feel secure about change. And behavioral responses, at the Human Services Department are now really viewed as kind of that basic need for security and reassurance rather than resistance to the change. Because everybody here does, a lot better. And I imagine in your organization, they do a lot better if they know what's in it for them and can really see the value of the work ahead. In my experience, developing peer support and encouraging self-care might be one of the most important motivators for change. I can't express this enough within an organization, as we as helpers often tell our clients that they need to fill their cup before they can pour from it. We're not really that great at doing that for ourselves or for our coworkers. And that gets especially hard when the workload is high and the resources are scarce. These are the exact moments where making time for self-care really should be a priority. And it's also why we've seen the importance of treating self-care as a group commitment rather than an individual responsibility here at the Human Services Department. So as Colleen and I wrap up here, I'd like you to kind of take a moment to imagine, how an employee responding to a traumatic event might be supported differently in a trauma-informed organization. And just a few examples to think of would be, how maybe a new parent as an employee might be responding to an incident of child abuse could potentially be, benefit from encouragement or time to work through the impacts of their vicarious experience during the workday. Or think about a worker who, with their own physical or mental health needs, might respond better throughout the day if they're given provided time during supervision to really engage in their process and work on those own personal challenges before reaching out to clients. You might also consider, how a director or a supervisor engaging with staff during a peer support group might really allow for increased connections as an organization and more effective collaboration across departments. These are just a few of the examples that we've seen over the past year or so here at the Human Services Department. And it's really, really exciting to think about where we might be in the upcoming years as we really continue to focus on this trauma-informed care. So I hope a few of these examples and activities have really, sparked some new ideas for you. I am sure that we could really, share experiences all day. And for the sake of time, obviously, Colleen and I will leave you with some helpful resources and our contact information. Definitely feel free to, reach out if there's some other information we can provide to you.
And if you have a minute, if you want to scan that QR code, that'll take you to some resources that we have already researched and utilized. And in fact, it also includes some of the presenters that Jamie mentioned. Lakeside is one of the organizations that we work with, and they're very reputable and have done a great job in training. So that was a resource for you too. Thank you.
Absolutely fantastic. Thank you all. And I'd like to open it up for both questions in regards to both presentations. And there is one question in the chat now that says, how many TCTSY sessions is optimally recommended for reduction of post-traumatic stress symptomology? Can survivors start at any point, or is there a time-sensitive module that they need to follow?
I'm going to be happy to answer that question as best I can. My understanding from the literature is that most of the studies were done on 10-week sessions. I've personally had the opportunity to work with clients, some even for as long as more than a year now. So I don't think that it necessarily has to be time limited, unlike other therapies where a person may be ready to put it down. Sometimes the yoga can be an ongoing source of support for individuals, not just for the healing of trauma, but to invite the opportunity to learn how to self-regulate and stay calm and be mindful and be in the moment. I don't know that there's an answer to that. I think that it's going to be really individually up to the client about when they might feel ready to be willing to try a body-based therapy? So that's a great question, and I'd love to read more about what research tells us about timing. I think it's up to the client.
That's great.
Yes, thanks, Jane. And I just want to kind of throw out there as far as turning point and how we offer things. For us, if trauma yoga is what you were interested in doing, all we ask is that you have an individual therapist. It doesn't have to be with us. It can be with us, but it doesn't have to be with us, because things that come up in the experiential therapies sometimes do need to be processed in talk therapy. And so we just want to make sure that all the survivors have support in some way to do that. So at Turning Point, you could just do the trauma centered, trauma sensitive yoga, as long as you had an outside clinician to process that with.
That's great. Thank you. I have I think a related question, especially as more teachers and more systems are becoming trauma informed and inevitably working with survivors of childhood sexual abuse. Often folks are inserting mindfulness practice into their classrooms or into their groups, but sometimes being in your body is a terrible place to be if you're not necessarily at that phase in your healing. And so could you offer any tips for people who are thinking about implementing perhaps mindfulness practice into not necessarily a therapeutic group that they might be cautious of or wary of, or some pitfalls to avoid?
Amber maybe wants to talk to this issue, and probably many other experts here who spend a lot of time in schools too. But I know that being trauma informed educates teachers to know that it can be very triggering to ask a student to sit still, or very triggering to ask a student to close their eyes. And so I think that we students who may be traumatized may feel trapped in those environments. So it may kind of have like the opposite impact that was intended. So that's why it may be helpful when people are not in a traumatic state to offer some body-based movements, maybe switching gears during a session with all children, so those who are traumatized don't maybe stand out as much, if you will. I'll turn it to those of you who have more experience with this in the classroom than I.
Yeah, I agree, Jane. I think it's really about choice, and I think that's a big piece of this, and the power and control, because violence of any kind, but specifically sexual violence, is all about power and control. And so the analogy that we use a lot of the times is, if somebody was robbing us and they were using a gun and said, "Give me all your money," that gun is the weapon that they're using to take power and control of you. Sexual violence is the gun. That's the weapon that they're using to take power and control of you. So our goal is always with survivors to help them get back that power and control and help them find their voice again. And so by offering choice in that, if you feel comfortable, close your eyes. If you feel comfortable, stand up in your chair and wiggle around, right? Because then that allows for the child specifically, individually, to decide if that's something that they want to do. And it's already been given permission that it's okay if you don't want to.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. And then for Jamie and Colleen, I find is that with any paradigm shift or any sort of change in food systems, that sometimes it's like shaking up a soda bottle, that you give people new information and there's a new way to do things that they know is probably the right or better way to do, but they come across old systems that can be in place that might be a lot slower to change. Have you found that in your work, and are there any tips in sort of navigating some of those barriers that organizations inevitably come across as they're becoming trauma informed?
Now, I will say building those relationships is really key. I know it's kind of different than the way we typically do things. And obviously you have to be careful of dual relationships and kind of the HR stuff that you got to worry about as you're doing that. But I will say we've seen a lot of relationship building really being the key to establishing trust amongst staff, amongst administrators, and that's kind of really feeding into what the work is, doing with our clients, just really creating that trust and that connection, and using that to kind of create a natural change rather than something that feels forceful.
Thank you. Are there any other questions before we transition into our next set of presentations? This is such important work and absolutely fantastic. Thank you all so much for taking the time. It's greatly appreciated. And Sarah Smith just heard, I think it's important to mention that TSY and TCTSY should not be prescriptive per se. It's a great tool to use in conjunction with other things. Great. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having us.
Absolutely. So our next session is really going to focus on addiction and some of the efforts locally to recognize the connection between trauma and addiction and in certain responses. So I'd now like to introduce Brittany Schultz and Samantha Smith to talk about the York Opioid Collaborative and the importance of a coordinated and multi-sector approach to reducing overdose and substance use. And then on building health for all, upstream substance abuse prevention approaches. So Brittany, would you like me to share your slides, or would you like to do so?
If you could share them, that would be great.
Absolutely.
Okay, so my name is Brittany Schutz. I'm the Executive Director of the York Opioid Collaborative, and we are a local nonprofit trying to tackle the opioid epidemic. So I'm here today to talk to you about the importance of a coordinated multi-sector approach to addressing overdoses and substance use in our community. Can you go to the next slide, please?
Sure.
Maybe.
So to give more of a historical context, I'm just going to briefly speak about the opioid epidemic and the onset of that, as well as how the collaborative was developed, what our mission statement is, and how we engage with stakeholders across 4 areas of focus, which is prevention, rescue, treatment, and recovery. It's important to note that addiction is a chronic relapsing brain disease that's influenced by a combination of factors in our environment, psychology, and genetics. The influences behind why someone may use substances and further go on to develop a substance use disorder are complex. An successful response requires a multi-pronged approach. Next slide, please. So a little bit about the opioid epidemic and the onset. So drug use has existed in our country since its inception, drug use for medicinal and recreational purposes. And opioids have been around since about the 1800s and were used for different, either for medicinal purposes or recreational purposes. Heroin was actually founded by a pharmaceutical company in 1898 to treat respiratory issues, but it was found that it had significant impact on pain. Again, drugs have been around for a while. But what we saw in the 1990s was this push by pharmaceutical companies to prescribe these new opioid painkillers that were thought to be non-addictive, safe alternatives to treat pain. So with the push by pharmaceutical companies, we saw a significant increase in prescription opioids being prescribed in the 1990s. Which led to us starting to see a significant increase in overdose deaths related to prescription opioids about 1999. From there, we saw either individuals transition to using illicit opioids as a result of prescription opioids no longer providing the need that they had, or they were cut off from the prescription opioids. So then we saw a rise in heroin deaths starting in the United States in about 2010. More significantly in York County, we saw that in 2014. And then over time, as the drug market changed, we saw a rise in synthetic opioids. And much of what we see today in terms of overdose deaths contain synthetic opioids such as fentanyl. And in the United States, we lose about 136 people every day from an opioid overdose. Next slide, please. So the York Opioid Collaborative, like I said, was founded about in 2014 as a response to the increase in overdose deaths locally. We were, at that time, our name was the York County Heroin Task Force. And the purpose of forming this task force was to bring together partners across different sectors to really take a look at what was happening in our community in regards to the increase in overdose deaths. We brought partners from the recovery community, law enforcement, medical legislators, school districts, community organizations, as well as community members to the table to talk about the impact. In 2016, it was recognized that in order to address the ongoing expanding opioid epidemic, it would require consistent efforts designed for long-term sustainability. And that's when the York Opioid Collaborative was born. And we became a nonprofit later in 2017. And so our work is to work again with collectively with partners to deepen and expand efforts to address substance use in all 4 phases of addiction, which is prevention, rescue, treatment, and recovery. Next slide. So again, expanding on our 4 pillars, prevention, rescue, treat, and recover. So within the prevention pillar, we really focus on primary prevention, secondary and tertiary prevention efforts. So preventing the onset of substance use in the first place, preventing overdoses, preventing relapses, as well as education and awareness of the impact of substance use in our community. Within our rescue pillar, we focus on harm reduction and opportunities to engage with individuals at a time of crisis and get them to support services or medical care. And then treatment is focusing on access to appropriate treatment at any point in terms of the continuum of their substance use disorder. And then recovery is supporting individuals in early recovery as well as long-term recovery and their families to ensure that they have access to supportive networks as well as any non-treatment needs. Next slide. So we work off of a shared common goal with community partners. So that means that everyone around the table has the same common agenda. We're working towards reducing overdoses in our community and as a result, reduce the overall impact of substance use. So like I mentioned earlier, we bring together organizations from various sectors in a very structured way to achieve social change. And that includes continuous communications across various different sectors and building those relationships, engaging either cross-sector initiatives or specific initiatives to certain organizations. And all of our activities mutually reinforce each other. So it works as if we're all individual puzzle pieces and we're coming together to try to form that puzzle. And that puzzle is overall, how does substance use impact our community and what is our response? And that works through sharing of information, either sharing of specific impacts within your organization, as well as establishing performance measures for initiatives we are implementing in the community. And it works because of a strong backbone. It works by having an organization that is really every day pulling together those partners to look at the collaborative effort of what we are doing in the community to reduce overdoses. And then I believe that's all I have for me.
Thank you very much. If you hang on tight, we'll open it up for questions after our next presentation. So Samantha Smith is up next for Building Health for All Youth, Upstream Substance Abuse Prevention Approaches. And Samantha, would you like to share your slides yourself, or would you like me to?
You can go ahead and share them.
Wonderful.
All right. So good afternoon, everyone. Before I get started, I just wanted to thank Brittany on her work in the community with the collaborative. And I'll introduce myself. I'm Samantha Smith, and I'm Community Health Specialist with the City of York Bureau of Health. And go ahead to the next slide. So this is just a quick overview of the learning objectives, and I'll go ahead and dive right into it. Go ahead, next slide. All right, you can move to the next slide. So to get started, I think it would be helpful to provide a quick overview on adverse childhood experiences. or ACEs and what they are. So when we talk about ACEs, we're referring to potential traumatic events that occur during childhood and that they can have lifelong impact. So what you see on the screen here are traditional ACEs, abuse, neglect, and household challenges or dysfunction. These 10 ACEs were those that were identified from the original CDC Kaiser ACE study, but it's important to note that these examples do not capture the full range of adversities that a child or adolescent may face, that there are many other traumatic ACEs that may be viewed as ACEs. For example, witnessing community violence, experiencing bullying, food insecurity, or experiencing homelessness. All right, next slide. Okay. ACEs are unfortunately quite common. We see a consistent story across data sources illustrating almost 2/3 surveyed adults reporting experienced at least one ACE in their lifetime, and 1 in 6 people reported experiencing 4+ ACEs. This is concerning because as the number of ACEs increases, so does the risk of negative adult outcomes, including physical and mental health problems, substance abuse, and other risky behaviors as shown on the slide. All right, you can go ahead to the next slide. As seen on the earlier slide, substance abuse in the home is an ACE, but we also know that experiencing ACEs increases one's risk for substance use. This data is from the original CDC Kaiser ACE study from the late 1990s. And what I think important here is to point out is that across the 4 different measures of substance use, current smoker, alcohol use disorder, ever used illicit drugs, and ever injected drugs, that the relationship between ACEs and the risk was similar in that the more ACEs that were exposed to, the higher risk for engaging in each of these substance use outcomes. This is really a foundational study that demonstrates the relationship of experienced earlier adverse child experiences and substance use. All right, go ahead to the next slide. Okay, so the pair of ACEs tree illustrates the relationship between adverse childhood experiences experienced at the individual level within a family and adverse community environments. So the leaves on the tree represent the individual level or family or symptoms of ACEs that are easily recognized in clinical, educational, and social service settings. The tree is planted in poor soil that is immersed in systematic inequalities, robbing it of nutrients necessary to support a thriving community. So adverse community environments such as a lack of affordable and safe housing, community violence, and poverty create a negative cycle of ever worsening soil that results in withering leaves on the tree. This is such a powerful model of thinking about how social and structural determinants of health drive the disparities that we see when studying who is at higher risk for experiencing ACEs and substance abuse. Okay, you can go on to the next slide. So now I'm going to transition the discussion to highlight our work at the City of York and how we use some of this research and background work. So the City of York Bureau of Health received CDC overdose data to action funding from the Pennsylvania Department of Health to implement overdose, opioid misuse, and substance abuse prevention strategies. So the Bureau of Health has partnered with Gavin, All Youth Access, and the York Opioid Collaborative to implement a public awareness campaign, which will hopefully be implemented in August 2021, following secondary data research focus groups regarding substance use and its impact on York area youth. All right, you can go to the next slide. So our secondary data analysis was reviewing Pennsylvania Youth Survey, also referred to as PAYS, which is conducted every other year in students in 6th, 8th, 10th, 12th grade to assess their knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors towards alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs. Some of the PAYS questions related to risk and protective factors, sorry, is what we really focused on. Was so the risk factors increase the chances of a youth having problems and predictors of problem behaviors, and the protective factors are conditions that buffer against risk factors and decrease the chances for problem behaviors. So this social development strategy is the framework that is used for PAYS, providing young people of all ages with opportunities, skills, and recognition, strengthening bonds with family, school, community, even young peers. So it's an easy use strategy. Go ahead to the next slide. This illustration just shows how the multiple risk factors can lead to substance use, and youth who are experiencing multiple risk factors are at much higher risk of related negative youth outcomes. And as we can see, a lot of the substance use risk factors, even though we label it as substance use, is similar to the relationship with the ACEs. All right, go ahead to the next slide. So based on our secondary data research, such as with the PAYS data, we had identified numerous social determinants of health factors that drive individual youth risk factors for substance use. So this became our foundation for the levels of risk for our youth and how we determined that we would have low and high risk youth that we wanted to look at. So to better understand the impact of substance use, like I said, we are going to look at high and low level risk for youth, and we are currently conducting youth focus group research to allow the youth to lead positive messaging creation, promotional efforts within their communities. We've also identified community partners to contribute with focus groups and engagement with campaign design and dissemination. So our ultimate end result is to create a campaign message, strategies, and assets that will lead to positive youth development and youth empowerment. You can go to the next slide. So these were some of our risk dimensions and subgroups that we wanted to make sure that we had covered as well. And you can go ahead to the next slide. And this is just some of things that we took into consideration, looking at our high-risk youth and COVID considerations, and our timeline, obviously, due to COVID considerations and the engagement with youth and other things like that. So you can go ahead, I think, click again. Yeah, so that includes all I have for the presentation. If you have any other questions or additional information you want to know about our awareness campaign, you can go ahead and contact me.
Thank you all so much. I'd like just to open it up for the next few minutes to any questions that people might have. Samantha, would you be able to speak a little bit about how you're approaching relationship building and accessing some of those high-risk youth groups in order to get their input for the campaign?
Yeah, so because of our restraints with like COVID and other things, we have recruited community partners that are directly working with youth. So it's kind of like train the trainer type approach that we will be holding a webinar for those community partners to kind of do the facilitation and get the feedback. So instead of like having a facilitator go in that you would normally for focus groups, they'll will be the ones that would either do like a one-on-one or recruit, like Gavin will be the one that will already provide the technical assistance and support for all of that, but the community partners will ultimately be the ones. So it's a bunch of different sectors that you normally wouldn't think, like we have like the housing authority, and it's a wide range of community partners that are involved in this project. So we did hold a webinar back in January. So you guys were involved with that.
Great. And just, I think this might be self-explanatory, but maybe not. Can you just speak just a minute about why you're framing it as important to have youth be involved in the creation of the campaign?
Yeah, so obviously you can just look at the data and see what you get, but making sure that their engagement is involved the whole way through, because you don't want to put out a campaign that isn't going to reach, or you get to the last step and then ask for engagement and you have to go back to square one. So really keeping that engagement along the way and making sure that, I mean, even the feedback, we held one focus group with the school district already. Just the feedback that we're getting already is interesting. Like, what platform do you use? So that's going to vary for age groups, you know, for social media. What you think and what they tell you is different. So
Absolutely, absolutely. And this is for both of you. I think any prevention work as well as response, stigma is always kind of front and center. How do your organizations approach addressing stigma and reducing?
So I can jump in a little bit about that. In regards to substance use disorder, we often think of stigma in 4 different levels, which is structural stigma, society stigma, self-stigma, and then stigma against medication-assisted treatment, which is a newer modality to treating specifically opioid use disorders. So the structural stigma is really something we try to tackle through those engagement with community partners and looking at policies and procedures and how do we, as systems, either respond or help individuals with substance use disorder. And from a society stigma, kind of to what York City Bureau of Health is doing, that's awareness campaigns. Anytime we can try to tackle the misconceptions that exist with substance use disorders in our society, and that carries over then into the self-stigma. Often we think of ourselves in the way others see us. So if society sees us as a certain way, you begin to believe that. So self-stigma is actually one of the biggest barriers from people with substance use disorder getting treatment, because they don't ask for help, because they think they're already thought of as lower. They think lower of themselves because society thinks lower of them. So they often don't seek out treatment. And then stigma against MAT. We're with our community partners, we're doing a lot around increasing access to medication-assisted treatment, as well as education about what that is to individuals with substance use, to individuals with their family members, and community, because there is a lot of old school thought processes around how do you treat substance use. Traditionally, it was always abstinence-based, and now we have medication-assisted treatment. And what does that mean to the path to someone's recovery? It's important to note that everyone's recovery pathway is going to look different. Just like their pathway to maybe using substances and developing a substance use disorder is different, their recovery is going to look different. And the more we can educate about that or make people aware of that will help to reduce some of the stigma.
yeah, and I think just adding what Brittany said, the education piece is so important. And there's guides out there about the language, just that piece about trying to encourage people to use the right language. And I think a lot of our work around that with encouraging community partners, and it's people that even work in it day to day, you may use a certain language, you know, one way, but that's, you know, just trying to encourage that. So
absolutely, thank you. And not to bombard you with too many questions, but I think there's just so much here as we think about treatment access, and not just access, but treatment quality. Do you notice any issues in regards to sort of quality or standards of care that are available to people in the community? Or do you see, and or I suppose, see the primary issue is just access in general?
I think one of the significant issues is how to navigate and access those services. Behavioral health services you don't access them how you traditionally access medical care. So you don't necessarily go to your doctor, although we're doing a lot of work to try to help and change that. Traditionally, you wouldn't go to your doctor and say, hey, I'm struggling with misusing drugs and be linked to services. So a lot of it is people's understanding of how do you even start to get help. And it's, as someone who's worked in the field for many years, it's not as simple as you think it would be. It's very complex at times, and it's difficult for people to navigate that. So I would say that would be one of the most significant. Over the past couple of years, there's also been a lot more research into the quality of care that's provided as we have more evidence-based practices come out. So that's changing in terms of the monitoring and performance management of treatment providers and the kinds of services they provide. That's great.
Yeah, I think not getting into it too much, but we obviously saw a lot of different issues arise with COVID, and, you know, not only with the access, but different, you know, with stimulus checks coming out and springtime right now, there being beds available, and how can we help get people into treatment? So there's a lot of other issues, plus with the big push of being like the lead programs and public health and public safety, there's a lot of work around there. So a lot of the big thing has been dual diagnosis. So we know that even facilities, they might not have as many beds available for that, or the push. So there's just, yeah, not trying to get into too many different avenues, but.
And I would just like to add also, I think when it comes to substance use and when you're thinking about other chronic illnesses, the topic of harm reduction, which especially in this field carries a lot of stigma. But thinking of, again, if we're thinking along that continuum of a substance use disorder, harm reduction has a lot of place in that, and what that means to individuals who are struggling as well as their families and the community. And I think thinking along those lines as well as when we're thinking about increasing access to treatment.
Thank you both so much, not just for your presentations, but for the work you do. And I believe the York Opioid Collaborative is also participating in Give Local York, and the link is now in the chat. So thank you very much. And let me now introduce our second keynote speaker, Dr. Monea Abdul-Majeed. Dr. Monea is a racial equity strategist, anti-racism trainer, and speaker. She leads organizations and wellness spaces to racial equity through training, strategy, and her 4R approach: reflection, relationships, restoration, and resilience. Dr. Monea is also a 500-hour registered yoga teacher in the Vinyasa style of yoga. She has been a dedicated student of yoga for 18 years and uses her knowledge of mindfulness to inform her racial justice work. A native of Washington, D.C., she lives in Pennsylvania with her husband and 3 children. So it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Monea. How are you?
Thank you so much, Amanda. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm super excited to be here. I just want to thank you, Amanda, for just how carefully crafted the whole agenda is, and your work for putting this together. So welcome, everyone. I'm going to get into sharing my screen so that we can, when Amanda told me I had 30 minutes, I said, how am I going to pull that off? I have so much to share. But I'm going to just go ahead and share my screen. Let's see. Wrong one. And so here's what you'll need today: a journal, maybe a cup of water, open mind, and open heart. And so the title of my talk today is Authentic Anti-Racism: Understanding Our Bias, Deepening Our Empathy. And here's what we're going to do today: a little bit of welcome introduction so you can get to know me a little bit, us opening meditation. I'm going to share a little bit about my journey, and then we're going to dive into authentic anti-racism. And I use a 4R approach to authentic anti-racism: reflection, relationships, restoration, and resilience. And we'll go through all of those. So you've probably, been in session, I guess, since like 8 o'clock this morning. So this is just my invitation to you to breathe with me for just a few moments before we dive in. So if you feel up to it, it's always my invitation, never required. Go ahead and sit up nice and straight. Draw your belly button back to your spine. Allow your shoulders to shrug up to your ears, and then relax them back and down. Drop your chin to chest, and maybe you close your eyes if that's for you. But if not, maybe you soften your gaze. Take your eyes off of the screen for just a moment, giving your eyes some rest from looking at the screen. Allow your palms to face up on your thighs. Let your fingers just be open, no clenching, no gripping. So palms faced up, just a symbol of being open and receptive to the present moment. And now I invite you to take a very deep breath in and a breath out. Deeply inhale. And on your exhale, just soften the muscles in your face, especially around the jaw, the eyebrow. That's where we store tension. Take a deep breath in. And on your exhale, allow your shoulders to relax back and down even more. Just allow yourself to settle. And let the breath calm your nervous system. Take your body out of fight or flight mode into a rest and digest mode. I'd like you to ask yourself this question. I want you to greet yourself with the sincerity that you would greet your very best friend. And just ask yourself, how am I in this moment? How am I feeling? How am I doing? And from that place, set your personal intention for our time together. This could be your purpose, your reason, your why. Now I invite you to draw your left hand to your heart. A place of love and compassion, deep gratitude, even forgiveness lies in the heart. And bring your right hand to your navel, right at the center where your courage lies. I invite you to join me in a group intention. That we will set aside everything we think we know and be open to a new experience, to going to another level, a deeper place of healing, and cultivating a community of care. Together, inhale. Together, exhale. Together, take a deep breath in. Take a long breath out. Once more, together, inhale and exhale. And as you're ready, you can flicker open your eyes. And maybe you come back into this space. Maybe you turn your camera on or leave it off. And so I don't know everyone here, but just by nature of you being here, I'm going to make some assumptions about you. I'm going to assume that you believe that racism does exist. It's not a theory, it's lived experience. I'm also going to assume that you wish to be a part of the change, right? Otherwise, why would you be in this conference? I'm also going to assume that you are willing to be uncomfortable and grow, right? So much of this work is about being uncomfortable, but also moving through that to change and grow. I'm also going to assume that you're willing to take a risk, This work is messy, especially authentic anti-racism. It can be very messy, very risky. And especially when we have conversations about race, people are often afraid they're going to say the wrong thing or they're not going to be well received. And so I invite you to step into that place of taking the risk. I'm also going to assume that you have the capacity to embrace paradoxes. So the thing about authentic anti-racism, we'll get into this, is that it's not binary. Oftentimes we have very binary thinking, right? Good or bad, right or wrong, black or white. But authentic anti-racism is about holding space for the many paradoxes that comes up in the work. So it's not just about being good or bad, right? Sometimes we can have really good intentions, but our impact isn't that great. Sometimes we can feel joy and hope, but also sadness, right? So I'm not into the binary thinking. I'm into this place of like, we can embrace the paradoxes and we can hold space for many different feelings, even if they might be contradictory. The next assumption is that you have pure intentions, and you attend conferences like this, you become a part of this change because you want better impact. So if any one of these assumptions speaks to you today, just in the chat, let me know. Just say, I'm here, I'm with you. I'm just going to stop sharing just so I can make sure, because so many people have their cameras off. I just need to know, oh, she's with me. Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Dot. Thank you. Oh, hi, Randy. Thank you. Thank you, Samantha. Oh, thank you, Deborah. Thank you, Scarlett, Lisa. Oh, that's Deborah. Hi, Deborah. Thank you. So good to be in my community. I love it. Thank you, Pam. All right. Thank you, Gail. Good to see you. Well, oh, hey, Dominic. He's here. All right. So I'm going to continue. So I want to jump now into a little bit about my journey, what kind of leads me to this place. And it kind of starts with the lyrics of a song by Sweet Honey in the Rock. There were no mirrors in my Nana's house. No mirrors in my Nana's house. There were no mirrors in my Nana's house. No mirrors in my Nana's house. And the beauty that I saw in everything, the beauty in everything was in her eyes. Like the rising of the sun, it was in her eyes. I never knew that my skin was too black. I never knew that my nose was too flat. I never knew that my clothes didn't fit. I never knew there were things that I missed because the beauty in everything was in her eyes. Like the rising of the sun was in her eyes. The world outside was a magical place. I only knew love and never knew hate. And the beauty in everything was in her eyes. Like the rising of the sun was in her eyes. So my mom was a single teenage mom, and I grew up in DC. I was raised by a village of Black women, Black men, led primarily by my grandmother. So she was the grounding force in our family and in our community. And like many other Black families in DC, she and my grandfather were a part of the second wave of the Great Migration. She had that Southern flair, but a city sassiness that drew people to her. So being raised by her and our village, our neighborhood, I had no idea that Black could be perceived as anything but beautiful. Because her love was so thick, I didn't know that another reality existed until one day she took me to work with her. I played happily with Emily and Greg. This is a picture of that day. She was a nanny for a white family in the upper part of Northwest, and she cared for these children like they were her own. So she took me to work, and I was just having fun playing with Emily and Greg. When it was time to go home, I didn't want the day to end. As we made our way towards the front door, I stopped in the hallway and I turned to Emily and innocently asked if she could spend the night at my house. She responded, "We're not brown, you know," and declined my invitation. I was confused. I looked at her skin, I looked at mine, and I was 4. I really didn't know how to make sense of it all. But in that moment, I learned one thing, that our skin was different. And this difference meant that she couldn't play at my house. Then came my college experience. I attended a predominantly white, historically all-male institution. This campus was beautiful, had a wonderful speaking tradition, honor code, and it was ranked among the best universities in the country. So I was supposed to be grateful, you know, because I was there on a full scholarship. This school had Confederate flags at every turn. I remember the day I was walking across campus in a red pickup truck with white men yelled, "White power." One of the white students complained that her daddy was going to be so angry that they were serving us nigger food when the school cafeteria served us fried chicken on Martin Luther King Day, which, by the way, was not recognized as a holiday. I hated how I felt when I was there. I hated the duality and the conflict of my emotions, and it was really taking a toll on me. I was depressed, stressed, but I couldn't fail out of school. I had to finish. I had to finish for my community because I couldn't let the white people be right about us. So I pushed forward. Then one day, in my desperation, I discovered a yoga class at 7 a.m. on Wednesday mornings. And if you know anything about being a college student, 7 a.m. is like early. But I tried the yoga class, and I remember trying a yoga class prior to that, but I thought it was boring and would put me to sleep. But I needed rest, so I went. I realized in those classes that if I wanted more peace in my life, if I wanted to be more useful to others, I had to find a way to heal from these deep wounds of systemic racism that I faced at this school. I had to find a way to heal from the trauma of interpersonal racism that I experienced with other students, and even the generational effects of internalized racism and systems of oppression. Yoga and mindfulness really helped. As one of my yoga teachers used to say, the issues are in our tissues. Let's just say I had a lot of issues in my tissues. I was holding the racial trauma of my lifetime and the racial trauma of my ancestors. So it wasn't just about the Confederate flags. It was about the memory of the enslaved girl who was raped, impregnated, and had her baby ripped from her womb and sold. It was about the noose around my forefather's neck that was used to kill and silence him forever. It was about shedding layers and decades of racial trauma that manifested in my physical body as acute stomach pains, headaches, tight shoulder blades, anxiety, depression. On an emotional level, yoga forced me to get real about how racism impacted the quality of my life, how crippling and debilitating it was, how burdensome it was to bottle up my feelings, hold them inside, only to watch them explode into radicalism. I was the rebel without a cause. Or my depression would just keep me trapped in my dorm room, unable to show up, wishing that I could bury myself and reemerge 4 years later when racism was over. On a spiritual level, yoga was the place that connected me to a higher power, something greater than me, a oneness that revealed this truth to me, that the only separation between Blacks and whites and among the races is the separation that we have created. So for years, I knew this was my life's work, but I had to do the healing work, writing, therapy, yoga, support groups. And a few years ago in this work, I made a discovery that shifted my perspective and influenced the message that I spread today. And this was a shift from hurt and bitterness to hope. This was a shift from complete aggression to authentic anti-racism. But first, I had to get really clear on the problem. So the problem that I began to discover as I looked at this history of racism in the United States was that racism, or this invention of race, was really about the exploitation of African labor for economic gain. Even the concept of whiteness was created for the sole purpose of establishing a majority to maintain the exploitation of African labor and the genocide of indigenous people. And so this is a major problem when we talk about exploitation, because it turns people into a commodity. In essence, it extracts the humanity from the human being. So when race was created and, we had the genocide of indigenous people, we were treated like animals who required less sleep, no protection. And also this problem of this exploitation and extracting the humanity from Black indigenous people of color, it also had an effect on white people that they may not have realized. It cut them off from their humanity as well. Because there is no way that a person can abuse another, can lynch another, can beat another human being without their own humanity being stripped from them. I came to this understanding that this problem is also in this ideology that makes us believe that we are what we produce. And this isn't just about, Black indigenous people of color, but this is for all of us, really, in this system of capitalism. How often have we cried because we didn't get the promotion that we wanted? Because we somehow believe that a lack of a promotion equaled a lack of worth. Or this idea that we see in organizations and nonprofits and corporations of grind culture, where we're working so hard to prove our worth. This idea of having to prove, for us, for Black indigenous people, prove our very existence by the work that we do. Or in my grandmother's case, she could work for the white family because they wanted her labor, but it had to stop there. They couldn't come to her home, her neighborhood, and really tap into her deepest humanity. And so when I understood this problem, I was able to come up with this solution, which I call authentic anti-racism. And this is leading. And when I say leading, I mean leadership at all levels. If you are CEO, even if you are the janitor, you can still lead in this way that honors the humanity and the lived experiences of all by strategically and continuously seeking and implementing attitudes, behaviors, policies, practices, and procedures that do not create or maintain racial hierarchy. Racial equity, and this is how we achieve authentic anti-racism, is about listening to and incorporating the voices of those most impacted by racism in every decision. And again, I mean leadership at all levels. So how do we develop this necessary ingredient of authentic anti-racism? Not just anti-racism, but authentic anti-racism. The way to do that is what I call the 4 R's: reflection, relationships, restoration, and resilience. So the first is reflection. And this is where we really have to tackle and get really clear on our implicit bias. So I work with a lot of organizations, and I'm always talking about changing policies, procedures, practices, but a lot of times we forget that it's people who reinforce these policies. So unless the people like change and reflect from the inside out, there can be no sustainable change. So first we have to get clear about our implicit biases. And these are the attitudes, the stereotypes that affect our understanding, our decision-making without us even realizing it. We have to get really clear on them so that we can unlearn them. We learn these biases. We learn that, the one bias is that, white people will frequently associate criminal behavior with Black people without even realizing it, right? This is a white woman walking down the street, a man of color is approaching, she clutches her purse, or she's in a car, she locks the doors very quickly, right? So it's implicit bias is not wrong. We all have it. Sociologists believe that we all have it. It's designed to protect us. But when it affects our attitudes and our behaviors and comes into this place of racism, then it's a problem. But the beauty here is that as we reflect, we have to know we learn them. So I want you to grab your journal that I said you needed at the beginning. And I'm just going to take like maybe 2 minutes. And I want you to think about school, preschool establishments, universities, organizations, even religious institutions, family. What biases did you learn? What biases did you learn? So just a brief moment here of pause to reflect. And I hope that as time allows, you will continue this reflection, because it is the very start to authentic anti-racism. We have to understand our biases, and we all have them. I do this work for a living, and I even have biases that I'm constantly trying to unlearn. The next R is relationships. Now, this is extremely important. First of all, we have to get really clear about the relationships that we have with ourselves, right? So we do that by personal reflection, taking that time to create space in our lives to really examine our biases, do some of the trainings, come to the conferences, do this type of work. But also it's about relationships. And the way that we really nurture relationships is through empathy. And so there's so many myths about what empathy is. I kind of want to go through what it's not, and this is my take on it. But, this summer, I remember reading, I didn't watch any more videos after George Floyd, but reading about, Jacob Blake being shot 7 times while his 3 children watched. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Trayvon Martin, recently Dante Wright, and so many names, I can't even list them all. But when I read these and listen and I see this, I get a lump in my throat. My stomach feels full and empty at the same time. And my children, I have 3 children, their faces flash through my head. I see my husband who likes to go for a jog around our neighborhood, and sometimes the tears fall. Other times I become numb and the tears can't even fall, they just stay, because I sometimes feel empty and tired, but also crippled in my deep love for myself, for my family, for my community, for BIPOC everywhere, for our world. And so when people say that empathy is walking in someone else's shoes, there's no way that you can walk into my shoes, step into my shoes as a Black woman. It's just not possible unless you have these lived experiences. And so that's a myth. Another myth is that empathy is seeing a problem through someone else's eyes, right? So here again, you'd never be able to see it through my eyes, but you can see, because especially, you know, for our white brothers and sisters, you see through the lens of white privilege. And that's, you know, that's not a bad thing, because what you can do is practice perspective taking. And that is the act of perceiving a situation or understanding from someone else's view. So that really means that it requires in a relationship some trust here. Because if I tell a story that is real and sacred to me, you're going to listen for understanding and you're going to hear that story just like I tell it. Oftentimes what we see is that a person of color will share their story, they'll share some trauma, something that's happened to them. And a white person might say, oh, you're being too sensitive. Oh, maybe you didn't see it that way. Oh, that's just John, he's sensitive. That's gaslighting. But really perspective taking is hearing the person's story as they share, not adding our own flavor. Another myth is that empathy is based on proximity, right? So proximity is not a requirement. It doesn't matter how many Black friends you have. Because sometimes people who have a lot of BIPOC friends, they think they're further along on their journey than they actually are. And that can lead to tokenism and many different things. So really, my definition that I want to offer up, and that can also lead to these transactional relationships, right? Not really the transformative, authentic relationships that we need for authentic anti-racism. So for me, empathy is a deep connection to the humanity of another. It really is. And first, that starts with the humanity that you have for yourself, your own self-compassion and forgiveness, and extending that to another human being. So the BIPOC friend is not the BIPOC friend. This is your friend, right? You connect because this is your friend. And I love this quote: if you have come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. Let us work together, because all of our liberation is bound up in this work of authentic anti-racism. Next, restoration. We have got to find a way, and I love that this conference was all about healing, because we have to find a way to restore within. Healing, guilt, shame. I work with so many white people who say, I just feel so guilty, I feel so ashamed. And we have to work through that so that we can be useful to each other. Healing relationships, repairing relationships, even if this requires professional help like therapy. I went to therapy right after college because it was so heavy and I had to sort everything out. So authentic anti-racism is about changing policies and procedures, but it's really about starting within. And when we think about restoration for our communities and for our world, we're not restoring, right? No, most of the time we think about restoring to a place we've been before, but we've never had an equitable society. So when we think about restoration for authentic anti-racism, we are restoring and repairing ourselves so that together we can reimagine and co-create an equitable society, one we have never seen before. So we need visionaries in this work. The last R is resilience. This work just keeps on going. We are never done. And when we get discouraged, we can take a break. We all deserve rest, but we have to keep moving. We have to keep attending the conferences. We have to keep doing the healing work. We have to keep breathing. So together, take a deep breath in and let it go. And in our final moments together, I'd like to play the song by Sweet Honey so you can hear them sing it.
There were no mirrors in my Nana's house, no mirrors in my Nana's house. There were no mirrors in my Nana's house, no mirrors in my Nana's house. And the beauty that I saw in everything, the beauty in everything, yeah, it was in her eyes. Oh, it was in her eyes. I'm telling you, there were no mirrors in my Nana's house, no mirrors in my Nana's house. There were no mirrors in my Nana's house, no mirrors in my Nana's house. I never knew that my skin was too black, and I never knew that my nose was too flat, and I never knew that my clothes didn't fit, and I never knew there were things that I'd miss, 'cause the beauty in everything, oh, was in her eyes, was in her eyes. Oh, there were no mirrors.
Wow. Thank you so much for this offering. It was incredible.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. So now we're moving in, and what a great way to transition to our last break of the day, our afternoon break. This will be a short one, just about 10 minutes to let Zoom have a hot second to itself. And we will come back at 3:10 for our last three incredible presentations, which will be addressing a range of topics, including resiliency and early Head Start families during the time of COVID, restorative justice in our juvenile justice system, as well as higher education, and getting pronouns right, gender and ethical reason to prevent harm, and then also disability justice in the era of COVID. So I'm so excited for our ending. And again, Dr. Monea, this was so wonderful. Thank you. And I'm going to log off just for a few minutes, but I will be back on in about 5 minutes to let everyone back in. Take care.